Other than the podcast itself, the best way to stay in touch with our various goings-on is to be on our mailing list. To sign up, go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click on Newsletter. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast featuring the musicians, writers, innovators, and ideas shaping media, entertainment, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on Josh Johnson, the Los Angeles-based saxophonist, composer, multi-instrumentalist, and Grammy Award-winning producer. Josh joined me earlier this year to talk about his second solo album, Unusual Object, which came out this past April 5th on Northern Spy Records. Equal parts futuristic jazz and modern composition, Josh uses processed saxophone and subtle samples in his unique compositions. In addition to examining Unusual Object, we discuss the relevance and impact of genre classifications in music, how Josh's Grammy has led to more opportunities and connections in various music communities, the impact of Chicago's artistic community on Josh's development as a musician, courage in the pursuit of creative avenues, and of course it would not be an episode of Spotlight On if we did not dig into process. So we did. Josh is at the Village Vanguard in New York, October 29th through November 3rd, with vibraphonist Joel Ross's Good Vibes Ensemble. It should be a good one. And now, Josh Johnson. I think talking about genre with artists is very difficult. It's not the most exciting discussion, but something that's interesting to me as it relates specifically to the Grammy win is this idea of like alternative jazz. I'm a voter, so when I open the ballot, you have to pick the categories that you're going to vote in, and I make a beeline to the jazz section. And it's always so interesting to see how things get filed and subfiled and classified. Mm-hmm. Do you think at all about like, what is that genre and what is that classification? Does it mean anything to you, positive or negative?
I think I have a lot of different feelings about it. I mean, I'm often asking myself, who benefits from genre? What are we hoping that genre does?
Yeah.
To me, that category, the naming of that category is somewhat of an acknowledgement that we're understanding that the labels that we have are not sufficient. We don't really know how to get too specific with this, but here's another avenue for music to be recognized within this institution. To me, it's positive that, there's an acknowledgement of, okay, we've been trying to fit so much under this one umbrella, and maybe it's not representative of the way that music is being made.
So just so listeners are clear, the Grammy was for Best Alternative Jazz for an album you produced for Michelle Indeacello. Mm-hmm. I think that if you don't want to think about it too hard, you could say, I guess that's alternative jazz because there's going to be a shorthand that develops and, it's not a Count Basie reissue. So I guess it's alternative jazz. Mm. And it's very interesting to think about that word alternative. Like, when you think about it in the context of rock music, it came to mean like what you were articulating. Like we have rock music and then we have this stuff that's like maybe newer and different. What my hope would be is that classification is almost like the incubator. In a few years, it's like, this is the new mainstream, or this is where the genre's moved forward. I don't know. I guess it doesn't matter for the music, but those things have a way of sticking over time.
Look, if it encourages someone to make music, I'm into that.
Yeah.
We're naming things after they happen. I think that spirit and that music is being made. I guess the question is, does a category like that bring some wider stuff that is happening in communities around the world,
Yeah, that's very fair. Given the diversity of work you've done, different players, different contexts, different roles within the project, have you noticed any sort of career impact? Does the phone ring differently, or do different opportunities come your way, or is there sort of a post-Grammy win impact?
I don't know. There's an impact that is less connected to career, maybe. Someone being like, hey, I saw you won a Grammy. Now I want you to be a part of something. But just like attention on other things that I've been a part of or things that are happening now. Maybe it's happened and it's just not that overt. If it's done something, I feel like maybe it's helped to connect me with other people in communities that I sometimes step into. I feel like I kind of move between a lot of different worlds.
There's something really encouraging and beautiful about the idea as well that the light from the Grammy can be sort of refracted to shine on these other projects and these other communities that you, like you said, you move in and out of that may not necessarily get the attention. And if something you're doing in one area can bring some love and light to those other areas, that's not a bad thing at all.
Michelle is somebody to me who like very much embodies that. And my feeling is like, if that's the name we need to give to the thing that's able to recognize a like unique presence and kind of maybe alchemizing presence in music, then like, I'm cool with that.
Do you have a sense of what someone is thinking when they think we need to call Josh Johnson? And might that be different when it's like an MD role versus a come in and help me produce a project role versus come in and do that crazy thing he does with the saxophone? Do you know what it is?
I'm not sure that I do. I think there are times where it's more general. We need a person who does this. We think this person would be a good fit. And then increasingly, it's where it has that, but it's much more specific. It's not just like, oh, the song needs a saxophone. And it's situations where I think I'm asked to show up with my perspective on music and the way, that influences how I make music with other people. Yeah, to your point, it's really different in different situations, and it can be hard for me to know. I'm finding that there are times when people really articulate really clearly what it is that they're looking for. There are other times when like that's something that we're going to find out as the music's happening. I think I'm learning to kind of walk in the room just like curious and ready to learn something. That's been a good way to navigate the unknown a little bit for me.
The word curious is definitely, it's a proxy for a certain like open-heartedness, open-mindedness, even to a certain extent, like bringing a vulnerability to the table that really allows you to be sort of tuned in sensitively as an artist.
Yeah, that's important to me. And I think something I've come to understand as as an important part of my like life generally, but also my life in music, is like leaning into that and seeing that as something that is, I don't want to say valuable in the capitalist sense, but can be energizing for other people.
Jumping just for a minute to jump into the Wayback Machine, can you tell me about sort of very early on, what was the music you were first exposed to? And then sort of as a corollary to that, what was the first music you chose to listen to as opposed to like the ambient sounds of your parents or what have you?
My parents, big music fans. So I think the first music is probably like a mix of like soul and gospel and R&B playing around the house, kind of soundtracking early childhood. I think when you're a kid, there's also like your access to music is through what you hear around you, and there comes a point where you become or have the means to kind of seek things for yourself. But I would say it was kind of like, it was like R&B and hip hop. But I was also sort of like playing music in church in a way, but kind of early still jazz came into the picture. I mean, that's really when I first started playing saxophone, 5th grade band or something like that. I remember taking to it and I remember for Christmas, like asking for some CDs or something of saxophone players. And I think my parents, they got me like a stack. Maybe it was like 5 things and 4 of them didn't connect with me.
Yeah.
And the one that did was like, it was like Lester Young compilation or something like that. I feel like I put it on and I was like, this dude's talking to me, like I would say middle school, high school, it was that mixed with some electronic music and like indie and post-rock stuff that was happening at the same time.
That's beautiful. That's some fertile ground right there.
Mm-hmm.
I love talking to artists that are from the Midwest in general, but Chicago in particular, just because of the sort of melting pot slash lineage for American music.
Mm.
As you grow as an artist and just age as a human being, do you have an articulation of the importance of Chicago to you as an artist?
It's interesting to have been away from there for so long at this point. I live in Los Angeles. I would say like Chicago, integral to the foundations of my music making experience as a player, but even more as a listener. That was the place I went, to like experience culture. And I think also such a fertile artistic community with a lot of infrastructure as well. It's interesting because even firm roots in Los Angeles at this point, but there's so many things still in my life or people that I'm connected to, people that I still make music with or have over a long period of time that like have roots in Chicago.
So the city was accessible to you. Like it was the kind of thing where if you wanted to go to a record store or find a gig, you could get in and out. And like, it wasn't this remote, distant idea.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it wasn't super, it required effort. That was like my weekend activity was like me and some friends. We're going to go down and we're going to see this show. And then we're going to go to this record store. That was excitement.
What was the initial why for Los Angeles as opposed to any other city or even staying in Chicago?
So I'd gone to school in Indiana and then I'd moved to Chicago. Through a few friends who were also kind of applying to this thing, was encouraged to apply to this fellowship program. The format of it was like direct mentorship from some like musical heroes of mine. So at the time, I was playing on these audition recordings for some friends of mine, and they were like, well, should we just split a day in the studio? Like, do you want to do one too? And I was kind of like, this would be a good thing for me to work on, just like a project, like getting this stuff together. One of the friends I recorded with like didn't submit his ultimately. Ended up getting invited to audition for this program, which meant coming out to California, which is my first time ever. Did an audition where, again, I was like, cool, just happy to be here. It'll be cool to play for some like heroes, and then I'm going to go home, continue life. But ended up sort of getting into that program, which essentially they take one band of musicians. It's like 7 people, and you get a master's for free, give you a place to live. So I ended up getting into it, and I was like, oh, I guess I'm moving to Los Angeles.
Well, amazing.
There were a lot of different kind of teachers who came in and out of there, but the biggest draws, it was Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock.
Ooh.
Yeah, I thought I would do that, and then I'd either move back to Chicago or move to New York. But once I finished that, I was like, I feel like I've just started to connect with and find community here. So let me stay for a year. Let's see what that's like,
Yeah.
It wasn't like everything was clear, but I think I saw enough things and connected with different people who made me like excited about some things happening here and like, yeah, just being able to explore some different interests in music here.
It's really incredible, the group of musicians generationally that have emerged there over the last 15, 20 years, however long it's been now. LA wasn't necessarily thought of that way. It's really fascinating to see how that city's emerged and the creative music scene there. It's just, there's so much great stuff going on. And the way genre is sort of integrated and transcended it's like some of the most exciting stuff.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's changed so much even in the time that I've been here. I remember like finishing grad school, deciding to stay and like telling friends who were in Chicago or New York that I was staying, and everybody's like, what are you doing? Why would she do that? And it's interesting to see some of those people. Some of those people now live here, Do
you mind me asking, could you share a Wayne Shorter anecdote? Like, did he drop any knowledge on you that like, I view him as almost like a Yoda figure, that he might tell you more about life than just about technique or harmony or whatever, that there's just Wayne Shorter. I mean, come on.
He was never really talking about music in musical terms. He's somebody who has this presence that kind of encourages you to pull things out of yourself that you didn't know were there. There's a lot of mystery to it, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
He's often talking about music as it relates to like an actor playing a role, a movie. And I mean, I remember one time we took a break from rehearsing and he's sitting at the piano. He just kind of like puts his arm down on the piano, just hit a bunch of notes and just like pointing to me. Like, he just goes, you got to play the same way you hope and dream.
Mm.
It's never like this, like, on this chord, you do this thing, but it elicits something out of you that you're like, I don't know that I understand this fully, but I'm reaching for something. And often what you find is something that's beyond speaking in musical terms. He said, like, do you ever try to play like a little kid? You ever play like you don't know how to play?
Yeah.
And there's a certain just like, it's abstract enough where you're kind of like, oh, like it's not about the saxophone. We're trying to tap into something much deeper than a note or a chord. Being around that presence really like, helped connect or maybe reconnect me to the why, reflecting on like, what's the space that you're like creating or trying to connect from? You can get so wrapped up in the tools that you can lose sight of what it is, like the why. What is it that you're trying to express? What's your point of view?
That strand, it's something that always fascinates me about the jazz world or the creative music world in particular, is that the poles of, in some instances, like deep conservatory training and intense technique and knowledge of harmony and composition and structure. And then the sort of other extreme of like oral tradition, the musician sitting with other musicians saying, to your point, like the philosophy, spirituality, learned wisdom, shared wisdom. There are artists that have both of those in different degrees. And there's just that, to me, like as a listener and that's where there's just so much like richness and regardless of which side of the microphone or the instrument you're on, it's a world that it just keeps giving. So beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's what we're drawn to.
So in the new record, in Unusual Object, what is the unusual object? Are you the unusual object? Is the work the unusual object? I love the title. It's so evocative.
That's kind of the question that I think it's all of the above.
Yeah.
It's me. It's the kind of world that music exists in, but intentionally somewhat open-ended to kind of leave room for others' imagination as well.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. Did you know that Spotlight On is completely self-funded by the team that produces it? We're looking for ways to keep the podcast self-sufficient without sacrificing the listener experience or the integrity of the show. The best way we could think of was to ask for the support of our listeners. Please consider making a donation to help cover our annual operating expenses. Go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click the word donate. If you can, please do. And if you cannot, please continue to enjoy the show. We're happy to have you as a listener. Thanks. And now, back to Spotlight On. Were there touchstones, either at the beginning where you said, I want to make something that's mine in the vein of X, or like there's so many different strands here that do come together, whether it's a solo saxophone or the sort of, in air quotes again, one-man show. I even think of like a Stevie Wonder record, right? Like just the idea that you can go into the studio and have musical ability as well as the technical ability to just achieve a vision. Is there any sense of context or lineage here that you could shed light on?
I would say not for the whole. There wasn't a template.
Yeah.
It feels connected to how I think about influence in music sometimes, of like, for some people, there's like a person or there's a record that they're like, this is the reference point. And I think for me, my experience, I don't think there's an exact template. I think within different material, there's like things that maybe I'm like in conversation with, ideas that I'm trying to explore. When I started making this, I don't think I was sure that I was making a solo album. And that's a question too in Unusual Object, is like, what's a solo album? And to me, that came to me like, it's really just one input. Because obviously there's like incredible lineage of like solo saxophone albums in more improvised music traditions. The short answer is no.
No, I appreciate that insight. What made now the time for this record? Because it is such a distinct, there's a lot about it that's very unique. And I'm just curious, is it time, opportunity, capability?
Sure, some combination of all of it. My previous record came out in 2020. And yeah, it's been a lot of life since then. There are ideas that I've been really kind of like just fascinated with, or like really have been developing a lot of times with other people. So I did feel a desire to be like, I've been employing this in other people's music and in situations that are more collaborative, but what's it like to try to like make a whole work from this? Like, can I kind of a challenge to myself, what's it like to try to like do it for real? The beginning of 2023, I stepped away from an MD gig that I was doing for about 5 years for a number of reasons. One of which was like, I found that it was occupying so much space that even when I had free time, I didn't have the energy to like take part in these collaborations that I know would really like feed me.
Yeah.
But part of that role is like bring new ideas, but also really to like realize other people's visions. So there's a part of me, as I don't think I thought of it as I was making it, but as I reflect on it, it's almost like a reaction to that in a certain way of like, okay, I'm swinging in the other direction, which is like out of my own curiosity and interest, but also maybe like as a way to kind of reorient myself. my priorities in music.
I love the diversity on the record. There's some pieces even that remind me of almost some like Synclavier works from the 80s of like Sterling, Lost City of Industry. They have this very modern classical sort of feel to them in my mind. What does composition look like in a project like this, especially, again, when it's one person? Like, are you writing charts? Are you, like, do you compose on the saxophone or on a piano? I'm really curious. I don't want to tear away your magic.
It's kind of all of the above. Yeah, I have a lot of different interests in music and a lot of different curiosities. And what I've learned about myself is things are best when I'm led by curiosity. There are some people for whom they start at the same place every time, and they're able to generate a lot of different things. For me, each thing is different. So there's stuff that starts on the saxophone, there's stuff that starts at the piano. A lot of it starts from improvisation. There's stuff that starts with a sampler, with a synth. There's stuff that starts from voice. There are things that sometimes start with, I don't know when I started doing this. I think I started doing it when I was just trying to become a better improviser generally. But I always kind of had a little notebook where as I'm doing something else, you dream up a certain scenario and it's like a solo that has this shape, only playing in this part of the horn and then contrasting it with this. And so there's always these little ideas that I write down as I have these curiosities. And I do the same thing with composing, where some of it is really just it's coming from playing or improvisation. Sometimes it's almost like imposing some sort of limitation, but a limitation that's allowing me to engage with my curiosity, to employ curiosity to get a different access point to creativity. I've found that for me, that's really important. And sometimes there are periods where I'm like, cool, I'm writing everything at the piano. But what I find is hopping around and using a lot of different processes keeps me engaged. And also, I think certain instruments lead you to certain things. When I sit down at my piano, I want to play everything in the middle of the piano. That's where it sounds best. But over time, that does influence some of the choices that I'm making. So I'm like, what's it like to hop over here, change its form entirely? Because it's going to lead to different ideas and different decisions. But when I was younger, I think maybe I had a more narrow view of what composition was. For me now, and a lot of what I'm exploring on this record is all the tools are available. Anything is fair game. I don't think starting on the saxophone or starting from an improvisation with electronics and then developing that idea is any less valid or potentially rich.
Yeah.
It's a mix of all of that for me. And then it's kind of trying to understand, okay, sonically, do these things live together? What's the kind of through line through this?
Obviously, there's going to be a fundamental Joshness to the pieces.
Yeah.
How does Josh manifest differently through what a piano can do and what a piano is than he does through a saxophone? Or is that bullshit?
It is different. It's different doorways to the same place. But that's fascinating to me because on the saxophone, I have a lot more facility. Sometimes that might lead me to writing something that is more dense than it needs to be because I can. Versus another instrument where I'm I need to move slowly here, or the fact that on a piano, I can see everything, right? I can see how it's laid out. And that influences how you hear too. And it's really different than the tactile feeling of, well, this thing feels like this, but it doesn't. I'm not seeing it, right? I'm not able to visualize moving from one idea to the next in the same way.
Gotcha.
And I find for me, that's where all the good stuff is.
Yeah, that sort of editing or refinement or just process, however that manifests. It's really interesting, though, to hear you speak about some of those things because and it comes up a lot when I speak with artists here that the palettes are so big and limitless, whether you're a rules-based artist or generative or whatever it is, it's actually super, super helpful in focusing to play around with the concept of limitations.
It's essential to me. And it's also interesting to me when you get to that point where you're I feel like I've exhausted this thing. So maybe now I need to expand that limitation. Different access points to creativity is the thing. And the instruments matter to an extent, but like imagination is the instrument. It's more nuanced than that, but I truly believe that.
Could you talk a little bit about the role of Paul Bryan beyond just the printed credits, right? It seems like there's a real collaboration going on there, or assist that he's providing. And I wonder if maybe you could articulate it, since I'm just going to sit here and answer the question for you.
I would love to talk about Paul Bryan. He is a close collaborator. He recorded and produced my previous album with me as well. We've played so much music together. We play in a band of Jeff Parker's called The New Breed together. We've been making music together probably almost 10 years now or something like that. One of the big contributions he made to this record is like really like sonically giving things a place or a sense of place.
Yeah.
And in ways that are often really subtle. He's like essential to the sound of the record. And in really like helping to frame the composition sonically. And what I mean is like these kind of subtle moves that draw your ear that help support the changes in the form of the song, or like help to treat it in the right way. Or I don't know, there's a way to keep a listener engaged outside of just the material. It's supporting the material, but sonically. And he's a master of that. Many of the tracks are a microphone, me with effects and electronics. It's like 3 tracks. There are fewer elements, but they're each able to occupy more space and be more detailed. And I think he's really sensitive and attuned to framing those moments.
I love that.
I think he was really helpful in keeping me from overworking things. Sometimes, I do a take of something and I'd be like, that thing. And he's like, that's my favorite part. And he often has the intuition to be like, hey, this thing, instead of like minimizing that, let's blow it up. Let's draw even more attention to it. And I think that's resulted in some really interesting things. And it's kind of opened me up in some ways to be like, oh, wow, what if instead of like, oh, that's a mistake, or I didn't mean to do that, eradicating this thing, it's like, what's it like to actually magnify it?
I'm really intrigued by the idea of the Mal Waldron piece that you included on the record. And I read this story about how Mal was in the car with Billie Holiday after Lester Young's funeral. And she said to him, I'm going to be gone next. And in a few months she was. We talked about lineage earlier, and just right there with this inclusion of one track, you're right back to where we started the conversation and where a lot of your musical journey either started or very close to the beginning. Could you talk a little bit about that track and sort of what's the why behind that? Because it's an interesting choice.
Yeah, many, many whys for that track. And the title alone and kind of in conversation with what is a solo album was really interesting. But that song is one that's like, it's so beautiful. It's been like haunting me. There's a feeling in it that is like so deep and so relatable. And it's really nuanced and complex, but it's very accessible. I don't mean that like, you can feel the depth and the weight of it, but it's like so relatable. And Mal is somebody who is so like idiosyncratic, like his voice and music. There's so much power in the restraint and like the kind of sparseness of it. I'd been drawn to it for so long, and I wanted to try to figure out a way to kind of like explore that same sentiment, but in the sonic palette that's a part of this record. And I think as I worked on it, it's a sentiment that I connected with, but also in conversation with Solo, and just speaks to also like a collective experience of the last few years,
Yeah. Well, thank you for making time. I really enjoy your music, and it's been great to speak with you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Josh Johnson. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson, with editing and sound design by Terry Graham. Our theme music is by Q Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, ongoing postings on our official blog, our online store, and a link to make a donation to support this work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.